much for allowing me to quickly go through these slides. Of course, at EAN, you can listen to our free weekly podcasts. You can subscribe to one of the sections in our Astro Library. You can become a registered student with us, and you can pursue homework certification as well. In our Astro Library, we have taken a dozen years worth of material and divided it up into 3 different sections between myself, Kim Marie, and several other evolutionary astrologers around the planet. You can subscribe for 1 month, 6 months, 12 months, or you can do a 1-month recurring. We also have our multimedia course, which at this point offers 3 different segments. It comes with a 3-ring tab binder, DVDs, transcript, and over 250 hours of audio files, and of course, our monthly webinar classes. The monthly webinar classes are in segment 1 and 2, and if you do not subscribe, or if you're not a registered student, you can always ask us for a free sample download of an actual class. And of course, this is finishing up the water element tonight. And if you are interested, next Monday, December 15th, we will have a public webinar on Uranus and Pluto as they approach their exact conjunction and square to the nodal axis. On January 12th, Pluto will be square the nodes, and on January 19th, Uranus will be conjunct the south node. So we'll look at how they are interacting with the nodal axis here over the next month, but they are within orb for a good 6 months from January, or well, either side of in the middle of January, 3 months on either side with these 2 planets. And so they have a pretty strong interaction with the nodal axis. So join us next Monday night, December 15th, for this class. And so here we are with tonight's subject again. We're going to cover the water element, which is the archetypes of Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. And as always with evolutionary astrology, when we look at one of the archetypes via a sign, we are also looking at its natural house and the planetary ruler as the same archetype that is interchangeable within consciousness. From your example here, you can see we're working with Aries, first house, and Mars. You can go Taurus, second house, Venus, Gemini, 3rd house, Mercury, and work your way around the zodiac. What we are working with in this series with the 3 modalities and the 4 elements is actually dividing the circle by 12, or the 12 archetypes of the zodiac. Many times astrologers concentrate on dividing that circle by 2, the polarities, 3, the modalities, and 4, the elements. In evolutionary astrology, we will also look at the harmonics of 8, which is the 8 phases in the circle. And of course, we also look at the circle being divided by 12, the harmonics of 12. When we look at a full circle without any division, we call that the harmonics of 1. In astrology by aspects, this is known as the conjunction, either new phase or balsamic phase. When we divide the circle in half, as you see on your screen, we're working with the harmonics of 2. And in astrology, we will divide that 2 into the 2 polarities, and when we do that, we come up with the active passive polarities. And if you look at the right side of your screen with pink, you'll see that the active polarity is energy moving outward from the center, or yang. Left side of the screen, the blue signs and houses, the passive polarity is energy moving inward back to the center, and we're working with the yin energy. We also can take the circle and divide it by 3. When we have the harmonics of 3, we divide the circle into 3, and in astrology, we divide it into the 3 modalities. And this is where we take the 12 archetypes and we come up with cardinal, fixed, and mutable modalities. More details on those, you can see the beginning of this fall series where we worked with these 3 modalities. Cardinal energy initiates, fixed sustains, and mutable adapts. And the modalities is more commonly known as a mode of action. You can see here we're either working with initiating, sustaining, or adapting and moving energy. We can also divide the circle into 4. When we're working with the harmonics of 4, you can see the division into the quarters here. However, in astrology, we'll take these 12 archetypes and we'll divide them into the 4 elements. Here you can see we're working with the element of fire, earth, air, and water. You see on your screen the circle divided by the elements in the 4 signs and their houses. Tonight we're going to be working with the water trine, which is Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. This is the element of emotions. We're also working with the 4th, 8th, and 12th houses. Before that, let's review the 4 elements. The fire element is spiritual, earth element is physical, air element is mental, and the water element is emotional. And while the modalities are known as a mode or quality of action, the 4 elements are commonly called a temperament, how we move the energy of the 4 elements through us. Are we thinking? Are we feeling? Are we into the practical of earth? Are we getting the spark of fire via spiritual? When we look at these 4 elements and compare them to the harmonics of 2, the polarities, we can see that the fire and air elements relate to active polarity. We can see that the earth and water elements will relate to the passive polarity. We can also then take the 3 modalities and the 4 elements, and when we look at them with the harmonics of 12, we can see that we have 1 each. The 3 modalities contain 1 of each element, and the 4 elements contain 1 of each modality as you see them on your screen. And so, when we move into the element of water and we're working our way through the element of emotions, we are coming up with a temperament of feeling our way through life. We're familiar with the 4 elements. We're familiar with the element of water and how it relates to the fluidity of the emotions, from being a calm lake to a running stream to a hurricane to the vastness of the oceans that we work our way through. On planet Earth, the element of water can appear in 3 different types of forms. We can have water that is so warm, so hot, it becomes steam or gas. We know water in its most common form as liquids, be it a glass of water, be it, again, a lake. Water always needs a container. When we work with it being cold enough, combining with earth, we will have water in its frozen form, which we will know as ice. And these three forms of water ebb back and forth. If there's any element of the universe that is always in constant state of motion, it is water. And that is the homeostasis of the water element, which is being able to be comfortable as it ebbs and flows and changes form from hot to cold. So when we work with the emotions through the element of water, it becomes very sensitive and sensing. Water can relate to fire. When it runs into fire, it turns into the steam and gas. When it runs into earth, it slows down so slow, it becomes frozen, and everything in between. Air will stir up water and create the hurricanes that I talked about just before. So that's looking at it physically. So looking at it again from the element of our emotions is being able to just be empathetic, sympathetic, moving around, through, with, merging another form, another human being, another species. The emotions of the water element are very comfortable with being able to interact, be a part of, interact with, merge with any of the other four elements. And as we reflect back on our humanness, just think for a moment, regardless of where your moon sign is, regardless of your Pluto house, think of how you, when you come into contact with another form, another human, an animal, a plant, the earth itself, think how you pick up on that energy, whether you're aware of it in the moment or it's something you become aware of afterwards. Think of how you yourself are always ebbing and flowing with all the other forms on planet Earth. Think of your human body. When you look at the human body, I don't remember, I think it was, is it 97% of the human body is water? I'm not remembering the exact percentage, but we have that skin, which is the earth element, and water and earth have a synergistic relationship together as the passive polarity. Think of how your skin contains that human body. And while we have the bone, while we have all of the organs and the tissues, all of it interacts, interrelates within this human form through the element of water. Water can become the, I'm not thinking of the word right now. Water can become that substance that allows us to almost speak between the bones, the tissues, the brain, the other parts that are contained within the skin of what we call this human form. And the same relationship takes place in the animal world as well. When we start looking at our emotions, many of you can just reflect upon your day today and look at all the different and varied emotions that you have experienced and ran through in the course of living your life and interacting with your environment. And so, with the distortions of the patriarchal conditioning, so much of our emotional nature, when it is distorted, when we feel any emotion that we will call quote unquote negative, it becomes known as distorted. We try to pretend that those emotions don't exist. in our broadest social sense, we just push those emotions aside. We put a smile on our face. Hi, how are you? How's the weather today? How you doing? Great, good. Yourself? Good, great. And we just kind of toss any of that emotional environment that is distorted or quote unquote negative. We just kind of push it under the rug. And yet, when we're working with the emotions that we know as quote unquote positive or beneficial, loving, enjoyable, easy to express back and forth, again, the hellos, how are you that we do with those we meet in a very circumstantial perspective in our environment, it's okay to express all of those emotions. That's how many of us will operate on a very personal level, which is Cancer, as we know. When we start moving into that element of Scorpio, the water of Scorpio, we start moving into intimacy, and then we seem to find that the closeness of that environment, water's containers, we start to be a little more expressive. We start to find that those distorted emotions will come up and out, not always in the most pleasant of ways, to the point that we can take it to its extremes as we look at it on a collective level in groups of people, and then it becomes one group casting out, spitting upon almost the other group all of the distortions of the emotions that we somehow do not think that is polite in society on a one-on-one, but boy, we can sure do it in those we're intimate with, in those we start to know as various groups in some way. Eventually, those emotions that get distorted go out to the broadest levels possible. And in some of the deepest emotional ways, it'll come through with Pisces in eventually feeling a loss of life force, a loss of emotional connection to ourself, our world, our environment, the people in our life. If we are learning how to process through the emotions rather than suppress them, we can start to take those ebbing and flowing of emotions and learn how to express them in their most natural ways, then move it from the most personal to the intimacy of Scorpio, to groups of people, to looking at how we can feel positive or good, quote unquote, around groups of people, moving it outward to the broadest extents with Pisces, where we learn to have that connection with all that is in our environment. And so there is much about the element of water and all its emotions that we're going to see is ebbing and flowing from we're connected or we're not connected. And so finally, as we're looking at this element of water, because water just goes anywhere and everywhere, it needs to have a container. And that's where the element of earth comes into the connection with water, because it provides the container on planet Earth, which again, most of Earth is the physical land and environment. Well, excuse me, most of what we see on the surface of Earth is water. What we see on the core of Earth is that physical element, and it provides the biggest container possible for planet Earth. And so, just moving through the essence of what I'm considering to be the element of water and its emotions. If I'm missing something, or if anybody has any questions or comments on anything I've not covered, feel free to say something to Leroy, and He can unmute if you'd like to ask or interact, and he'll answer your questions typing in on the Q&A as much as possible as well. So let me just stop for a moment, check in with Leroy, check in with anybody else. Questions or comments with anything that I've said? I think most of us understand the 4 elements pretty easily.
Well, I just want to add a couple of keywords that I was thinking about while you're going through this, Kim. And as it relates to Cancer, a word came up called permeability. You know, permeability, particularly in the context of what you established, is sometimes how incongruent we are with how we're feeling versus how we are acting. And as we evolve, and, you know, particularly a lot of people that would be on a call such as this can certainly, in their own emotional homeostasis, recognize that disconjunct or that that disconnect between, you know, the real emotional state and the words that are coming out. So that permeability, you know, I'm just kind of thinking it was a great Cancer word. And then, you know, with Scorpio, it's like solubility. You know, solubility came to mind for me because that's when you really merge with another into a solution of two. And then, of course, all of the, you know, sensitive vibrations that go with that. And then, of course, ultimately, as we work through Pisces energy with this water element, it's dissolution. As we dissolve all of those emotions into a container of one.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice. Yeah, what you're reminding me of is basically what we'll know through the Pisces and Virgo archetype is the distortions from natural law. And of course, that's the square to Sag and Gemini from the archetype of Pisces, dealing with that mutable modality. And what it brings to mind again is that Garden of Eden myth, where we've had such a separation between spirit and flesh. And when we look at flesh, it's not just the flesh of the body, which is the earth element. It's also the flesh of the senses, which is the water element. And because we've been in such denial of the flesh and the senses, there's extreme denial of all of the emotions. And so one of the things that we work with evolutionary astrology is being able to realize the two sides of the coin almost between spirit and flesh. You know, spirit being that spiritual mental element and flesh being that water earth element. And so again, as we realign with natural law, recognizing from that Piscean sense that we are all one, then we learn to be more in touch with the body of our senses and the body of our emotions. So, moving on, any comments or questions before we do? I made my notes for my 3 water signs before I realized I didn't add in the distortions, and yet I think we can look at the words that we have here on your screen and be able to pick them out. When we work with the first of the 3 water elements, Cancer, which is also 4th house in the ruler moon, again, with all 3 water signs tonight, we have passive polarity. However, here we have the cardinal modality, which is initiating. And when you just look at water flowing through, passive energy moving inward polarity and cardinal initiating modality, you see the fluidity. You see the sign of Cancer and how we have the 2 circles flowing into each other, looking at your screen in the upper left. So water ebbing back and forth, passive cardinal. As the first of the 3 water elements, Cancer is the archetype that will relate to what we call our early nurturing environment or our nurturing parent. We have survived birth. We're learning to interact with our environment, and how we go forth into the world, Capricorn polarity, from our environment depends upon how safe we feel, how much of a container we feel that we have emotionally in our early childhood. If we feel safe in our environment, we learn to trust the environment. We trust the parents that are raising us. We then go out trusting into the world. So you can see how the archetype of Cancer will relate to home and family, how it will relate to children in the early environment, and it will relate to the parents that raise the child. We can then also see, because of that fluidity of water and the polarity and modality here, passive cardinal, that again, we have all of these emotions that go back and forth, ebb and flow. And in EA, we will say that our emotions vacillate from withdrawal to animation. When we go through emotional withdrawal, what happens in our environment, not only our early environment, but carried forward as we evolve and grow into adulthood. When we have an emotional trigger, we go in upon ourselves. We go inward, passive polarity, and we try to figure out, why do I feel this way? What's happening to me emotionally? What's happening to me in my environment? Why am I triggered? Many times what will happen is it brings up wounds. We do not live in a perfect world. So there will be wounds in that early familial environment. There can be wounds from past lives, and we may not be conscious of them, air element, but we will feel the memory of those wounds on unconscious levels. And so many times when we're triggered into that emotional withdrawal, it can easily be a past life wound that could be re-imprinted in our early familial environment, and the two blend together and we just know it as a trigger and we go inward. And if we ponder it, if we are working to be in touch with our senses, then we are asking why, what is happening. We're looking to make it conscious. We're looking to heal it in some way. We're trying to process through the emotions and understand them better. And we're working to re-establish that emotional equilibrium or balance of some kind. Now, if we're going to look at the distortions of emotional withdrawal, we'll easily go back in and re-imprint the victimization and the wounds without making an effort to understand why. We cling to our story. We learn to look for security through the wound rather than trying to be mature Capricorn polarity about looking at that wound and saying, why did it happen? What do I do about it? So we'll get triggered into that wound of withdrawal, and we can become very defensive, close down, isolate ourselves, and just get almost stuck in the emotional help me, my word, infantilism, I think it is. We'll get stuck in our emotional childishness and not grow. And that, again, passive polarity cardinal modality just circles and circles and circles. We're stuck in the emotional environment, whatever it is. So again, the purpose of the withdrawal is really to ask why, to question it, to try and figure out what triggered us. How do I feel? Why do I feel? How do I process? How do I heal? If we're working in that level. Then once we do, we'll flip into the emotional animation, as we call it in EA. We'll have established that emotional equilibrium and balance, and then all of a sudden we're wanting to emote with everybody. We want to feel, we want to share, we want to hug, we want to touch, we want to be able to go out there and sense and give on emotional levels. We become very emotionally outgoing and sharing with our environment and our world. If we are distorting on an animation level, we kind of go emotionally overboard. We might have reached some new equilibrium, but there could be something that is not quite balanced about it, and we go emotionally overboard in the emoting. And we can go through the extremes of withdrawal animation. Sometimes that can be called bipolar. Sometimes that can be called passive aggressive. You can use those two words with any of the emotional or water element. You can use it with air. I've never looked at a lot of our classifications of diseases as being limited to one element or one modality. It many times is understood multiple ways, including modalities and elements. But the whole purpose, when we go through all of these emotional vacillations, is to be able to achieve through the archetype of Cancer, fourth house, and ruler moon, is what we would call emotional self-reliance. In other words, even though that element of water keeps ebbing and flowing, we want to reach some level of feeling an equilibrium, feeling a foundation, feeling self-reliant through all of the emotional changes and ebbs and flows. And when we reach that emotional self-reliance, or as we're always moving towards it, water, what is one of the most basics of the water element through the archetype of Cancer is inner security. We can always go within and find that equilibrium, find that emotional homeostasis, find that ability to feel okay, even as we grow up, move through adulthood, become our own parents, go through the ebb and flow of all our relationships, and eventually circle back around to the winter of our years as a human, to our senior citizen years, and always be able, as that outer world ebbs and flows, Capricorn polarity, to move through again that inner security, that inner environment that tells us we're okay, regardless of what ebbs and flows in that outer world. Sometimes if we're looking at the distortions of the archetype of Cancer and we don't have inner security, we become hypersensitive to controlling the outer environment, to controlling the home, to control who comes in and out of our home, to becoming the hermit in our home, to becoming very, again, controlling of who we allow into our inner world. And of course, combining that polarity of the water and earth elements, the skin and the nerves and senses beyond it, within it, the archetype of Cancer and its polarity Capricorn will have a lot to do with touch. Just think of how when somebody touches you and it's the lover and it's such a soothing, easy touch. Or it's somebody that you perhaps don't get along with the best, and they touch you and your skin jumps. You jump out of your skin, as they call it. Think of how just the touch of the skin by someone else, or you touching someone else, think of how easily you immediately move into emotions of some type. So that whole element of touch not only belongs to the archetype of Earth, it also belongs to the archetype or element of water. And in natural law, it is the emotions, it is the element of water that moves us back to what is natural and healthy for ourselves. So anything that I've not touched upon that anybody has questions or comments on before we move into our chart example? All right, so in this series, what we've been working with is charts, from the entertainment industry of mainly actors and musicians, because these are people that most of us already know, so we can simplify a lot of the environmental conditioning here. So this is the chart in the Cancer archetype for the actor Harrison Ford. Birth data is July 13th, 1942. 11:41 a.m., Chicago, Illinois, and the rising sign or ascendant is 2 degrees Libra, 46 minutes. And so when we start to look at this chart, we see that we have the whole archetype of Cancer on the midheaven. On the top of the chart, we have 4 planets in the sign of Cancer. We have Mercury 1 degree in the 9th house. Jupiter is 7.5 Cancer. We have a Sun conjunction with the Moon, new phase between 20 and 23 degrees Cancer. So ruler Moon is in the sign of Cancer, its own rulership. And so as we're working with Harrison Ford, most of them will know him from the Star Wars series, Han Solo, who did the romantic male part in the series. And we will also know him from the Indiana Jones series, in which he, played the male who was always on a treasure hunt and, oh, by the way, always got the girl as well. Now, Harrison Ford, as I was doing my research for him, is well known for being very, very private about his personal life. He has been married 3 times. With his first wife, he had 2 sons. With his second wife, he had a boy and a girl. And with his third wife, he adopted her son from a previous marriage. He was raised in a very blue-collar home. His mom was a homemaker. His father was an advertising executive who tried to make it as an actor, didn't succeed. Harrison Ford has a younger brother. When he was asked what type of religion he was raised in, his response was jokingly, "I was raised as a Democrat." So again, very blue-collar background and very much a Democratic background as well. He was a Boy Scout in his childhood. He went all the way through to become an Eagle Scout and then a Life Scout. And when he connected with the director Steven Spielberg for the Indiana Jones series, they based that series upon their common ground and history as both coming up as Boy Scouts. So a very, what would you call it, mom, apple pie background, and yet with the signs being on the opposite houses of which they naturally rule almost all the way through all 12 houses here. We can see we've got mom and apple pie up here out in the world, out in his career. He went to Hollywood in his early years and didn't have success right away. Had a lot of bit parts in various television series and different movies. And so in order to make ends meet, he went to work as a carpenter. And it just so happened that he worked on the home of George Lucas. Now, Cancer, carpenter, and he goes to work for George Lucas. And in working in his home, that is how he came to audition and get the part for the George Lucas Star Wars series. So you can see the symbolization there with Cancer working out of somebody's home, and through that emotional home environment connection, boom, here's the career. And of course, as we know, America fell in love with Star Wars to the point that they have moved on and continued movies as well into the series. I'm not real up on all of those, but I do know that they have talked Harrison Ford and the actress and the young kid that was in there, and Leroy, you might be able to help me with some of those names. The early characters, they've talked all of them into coming back as they are doing this latest Star Wars movie. And Harrison Ford, on the set of that movie, had a hydraulic door fall on him and he broke his ankle, and that happened here just this summer. So the movie's been delayed a little bit and they're having to rewrite some things for him because of course he's not quite as active as he used to be in his early 70s. Now, one of the things to realize from the archetype of Capricorn through the element of Earth, 10th house here, is that this rules the skeletal structure. And through the square to first house Aries, which rules muscles, we're going to get the musculoskeletal structure here. And as a matter of fact, we can use the cardinal modality here, first, seventh, fourth, 10th houses, for the whole musculoskeletal parts of the body. And so Harrison Ford has a history of back injury, breaking this ankle, having various aches and pains of that skeletal system as he has come through his life as an actor. You don't hear a lot about it unless it is really intense and it makes the news. He's very quiet about it, but this seems to be a history for him as a human being. And so ruler Saturn of that 10th house is up here at the top of the chart too. It's sandwiched in between Venus and Uranus in Gemini, so I would venture to guess there might be some nerve stuff in this as well. Now, back to a little bit more in regards to him. All these Cancer planets in the 10th with the ruler Saturn being in the 9th. He also has a history as loving to fly. And so he flies not only his own airplanes, but he also flies helicopter as well. He keeps planes and helicopters in California, the Hollywood area, and in Wyoming. And as a matter of fact, when he's in the Wyoming area, he volunteers his helicopter on search and rescue missions when they need help with skiers or hikers or anybody that gets lost in the Rocky Mountains. And so he did go through a plane accident early on as he started his success after Star Wars, and crashed his airplane and was able to walk away from it. And so Neptune 12th, bleeding a little here, South Node in Pisces, the grace of God element that starts to come in here. He was a Jupiter, good luck, up here in Cancer at the top of the chart. He was able to walk away from the plane crash with barely a scratch, so they say. He has, again, had a history of wounding himself in various ways, but it's almost hard to get a lot of information from his life because there is so little that he shares with anybody else. I would say that chances are he's probably very close to his family. He is probably close to the children, communicating with them. I've not heard of any scandals with 5 kids and 3 different partners. You've not heard of any scandals as you sometimes do with famous people's children and all the entitlement that they grow up with. And so as I start to wind down here, if anybody has any questions or comments with anything, you're more than welcome to chime in or ask me a question. Anything you see that I'm not covering. Basically, when I looked at his chart, I thought, here is someone who is so well known and so loved. You've really not heard of very many scandals for him. And that's where that Cancer is very, again, contained with that inner world, contained with home and family, contained with that home environment, even as you look at Mercury and Jupiter at the top of the chart. Mercury's balsamic Jupiter. And so when do I share and when do I not share? And then the ruler of those 10th house Cancer planets by house, Saturn, up there in Gemini 9th, and he does his talking through his flying. So it'll be interesting to see how the public relates to him as this latest issue of Star Wars comes out. He also did, I should say this in regards to the whole Cancer planets in the 10th. He also has done a lot of series where he plays the hero in cop roles, detective roles, CIA roles. He did a lot of that after his Indiana Jones series as well.
And the father figure, he comes off as a father figure in many of his roles too.
That's probably what we can see, if he didn't, suffer too much injury with his ankle in this latest Star Wars. We should really be able to see him come back in this next movie or maybe a series of up-and-coming Star Wars movies and really being that elder father. You're right. We might be able to see him really take on that role over the next decade of his life if his health permits.
A student on the board wants to get your impressions. It might be a little bit out of the context of this water element subject we're on tonight, but that Saturn, new phase Uranus, and Gemini square the nodes. Any comments about that?
Mm-hmm. I think that he is probably, we're talking about Uranus 3, Saturn 8 degrees Gemini, their new phase. It is square the nodes of the moon. The resolution node going retrograde as the nodes go is the south node in Pisces 6th. I would say behind the scenes that he is a very, very empathetic fellow. I'd say he kind of carries the set on any movie that he is a part of. He can shine the Leo planets in the 11th house, but that Chiron in the middle between Mars and Pluto kind of calms that down a little bit. And so when you look at these planets, Gemini, 9th house, he probably could tell a lot of tales behind the scenes on a movie set. He probably has a lot of words of wisdom that he shares in his familial environment, that he shares with everybody else. For all we know, he could be into alternative healing, but we're not going to hear a word about it in the public, being a Cancer. He's well known as being a lifelong Democrat, very supportive of the Democratic Party and liberal issues. However, not real outspoken about it. And this can be Saturn calming down the voice, quieting the voice. Uranus in Gemini is not always going to be totally outspoken. We may find that there might be some memoirs that'll be published about him after he departs the physical body. And so I would say his voice is there, but it doesn't have to be real loud. It probably, again, is something that is more behind the scenes. That container Cancer, even up at the top of the chart, Mercury, balsamic Jupiter, holding in the voice, thinking before he speaks, balsamic phase to Mercury, Jupiter. Now, behind the scenes in the personal environment, if you talk to the ex-wives, I bet you they would say that there would be an anger that would come out. Sometimes, if you remember some of his roles in Star Wars, Indiana Jones, he would bring the voice out. He would be the rebel. Look at him as Han Solo in Star Wars and being the reluctant hero in Star Wars. And so that voice can be there when he wants it to be. He can bring it out for his roles. It's probably there in his early environment. Again, this resolution node, there's something here about him that's going to have, and ruler Neptune, Virgo. Yes, beside the point, but we're back to a water house here and a water sign. There's something here that says, quiet down here on a deeper level. Any other questions, comments in regards to him? Okay, moving around to the archetype of Scorpio in the water element. Again, we are working through the passive polarity. And here we run into fixed water, the fixed modality of water being very sustaining, persevering, long acting. That water temperament just tends to hold the emotion, whatever it is. When we get to the element of water, here we start to look at the ebb and flow emotionally with another person, with someone or something outside of ourselves. And so here is where we start to run into the emotional merging on a very intimate level. With Cancer, it was mom, dad, home, family, early environment. With water, it becomes the intimate other. So Scorpio in EA becomes well known. This is who we commit to. This is our lover, our partner, our spouse on a long-term basis. And when we merge with another, not only on the physical sexual level, but also on the inner emotional level, through that merging, there's an osmosis process that takes place whereby we become more than we were before the merging with that other. This is where the archetype of Scorpio is known as shared resources. Now, traditional astrology, Scorpio is well known for the act of sexuality itself, polarity of Taurus, earth element, self-sex, Scorpio, water element, we have sexuality with another. And as a matter of fact, when we literally go through the physical act of sexuality in human consciousness, human species, both the male and female have an exchange of fluids. They literally have a release of fluids, water in some way, and they literally exchange it with the other. So right down to the most outward manifestation of the water element, we find it sexually in the archetype of Scorpio. We also very commonly know then Scorpios through that merging, through that sharing, as the sharing of resources. Yes, money, but it's also sharing of everything else that we can look at on a manifested level from the earth element. So resources on all kinds of levels, including emotional resources, intuitive resources. Just think for a moment on those you're emotionally close to in adulthood. And when you are close to them, physically or not, when you are sharing with them, think of what an emotional resource they seem for you, and vice versa. You do the same for them. That's where that fixed modality of the water becomes very sustaining and supporting. We feel better knowing this person's got our back, knowing they're with us, knowing they're supportive of us. They feel that way, sensing the same from us. So Scorpio, through that passive polarity, it becomes magnetic. We draw the water to us. We draw the emotions and the senses to us. This is where Scorpio is known as that psychological detective. They know how to just vibrate and attract it in, whatever is out there in their environment via another or just via the environment. And they can just read the senses. Fixed, sustaining water. They read the emotions. They read the environment. They know how to go beneath the surface, passive polarity, and they know how to figure out what makes another tick. They know how to intuit how another person is put together. This is what can make that element of Scorpio such an empath, such a healer, such a good psychologist. So knowing how to be helpful and supportive to another. Now, if you look at the distortions of that, if we did not have healthy emotional self-reliance through the archetype of Cancer in our early environment, we look at the outer world as very untrusting, as very insecure. Then we start moving into the distortions of the archetype of Scorpio, and we've got to control those we merge with. We've got to control our stuff. We've got to control sex. And we can take it to all the Scorpio word distortions that we know, such as we've got to manipulate the other in our environment. We've got to control it. We've got to become very possessive. We become, because of the fixed modality that we get ourselves, put ourselves, move ourselves into an emotional environment, and we want to sustain it. If that environment changes, fixed modality, we can become very insecure. We can become fearful. We can become, again, we start to get controlling of that environment, and we go to the worst of what we know Scorpio as. We become wounded through what we would know as abandonment, through the emotions changing, betrayal through the intimate other deciding that they no longer want to sustain an emotional environment with us. If we are moving through that emotional self-reliance, we can still go through abandonment and betrayal, but that water then turns that psychological, emotional sensing energy inward upon itself again, passive polarity. Why is this happening? Why do I feel this way? It can go to that Taurus polarity and reach for a deeper level of physical self-reliance. Reach for a deeper level of emotional self-reliance coming off of the Cancer archetype. So we can see through Scorpio that we can run into what we would call emotional extremes. And the extreme energy comes from the relationship with that fixed modality. Scorpio feels deeply. It just sinks into that energy, whatever it is, emotionally. It'll sink into the distortions. It'll sink into the natural expressions. It'll sustain the bad or the good. And because it's passive polarity, this is where it runs into needing that shock, that volcano, the tempest in the storm that has to get stirred up because it's passive polarity, fixed modality. That Scorpio energy many times will have to get stirred up by its environment, be it the other or literal environment, in order to bring about a metamorphosis of that emotional energy. And so when it moves beyond that fixed modality of the emotions and water, this is how we start to recognize it slows down the water, but it still is an emotional ebb and flow. Water still has a death and rebirth. Whatever we were looking at on an emotional senses level, sooner or later it's not sustainable anymore. There has to be a release, and more water and more emotions come in. So the emotional death and rebirth with the element of water can range from literal, again, Taurus polarity, earth element, physical, to an emotional death and rebirth that is figurative all over the place. From little, emotional homeostasis in our life to such as how we like to go about our world and our routine and our environment, to major recognitions on emotional levels of something that no longer sustains us and opening up to something new that does. On a figurative level, letting go of emerging with one partner, finding ourselves again, and then being able to merge with another partner again on a deeper, broader, more emotionally intuitive and sustaining level. Now, many of you know in evolutionary astrology that the ruler of the water archetype, the ruler of the 8th house, Pluto, in EEA, Pluto is known as the soul and a dual desire nature. The desire to separate from that which created us and to have our separating desires that we exhaust through achieving them, and the desire to return to that which created us, the desire to know source again. So can you see, through looking at the element of water via Scorpio, can you see how Pluto, as the soul and its dual desire nature, the separating, returning desires and carrying it out, separating, returning forces in the universe, can you see how it is so emotionally based, the element of water? Can you see how those separating desires can be sustained again and again and again through the fixed modality? Can you see how the dual desire nature is an ebb and flow, an ebb and flow, and eventually, with enough exhaustion of the separating desires, and emotionally, I want this, I want that, returning to, I want source, passive polarity. Sets us up for the archetype of Pisces. To be continued. So, before I move into my example, any questions or comments, anything that I've not touched upon as I take a moment for a bit of water. Here we have the chart for the Scorpio archetype of the water element with Elvis Presley. Who of us does not know Elvis Presley? He is known all over the world. His birth date is January 8th, 1935, 4:35 a.m. in, I'm not going to pronounce this, Tupelo, Mississippi. Tupelo, Mississippi.
Tupelo.
His rising, Tupelo. Thank you, Leroy from college in the Southeast. His rising sign is 1221 Sagittarius. And so when we look at this archetype of Scorpio, I just really saw Pluto in the 8th house, conjunct the south node of the moon in the 8th house. Pluto's retrograde 25 Cancer, so we're carrying on with the Cancer archetype. South node is 1 degree Leo. South node is balsamic Pluto. But you can see right here, Pluto in its own house of rulership, the 8th house, Scorpio house, Pluto ruler of Scorpio, with the south node, ego of the past. That right there is just such a strong archetype for how we see this soul and how he has achieved greater fame in death than when he was alive. Now you can see we have a stellium of planets over here in Capricorn, 2nd house, opposite. Planets conjunct the north node, something about his soul pulling the past forward. We also see the sign Scorpio ruling the 12th house archetype of Pisces, and we see Jupiter in Scorpio inside that 12th house, and I think this has a lot to do with the fame and fortune after death as much as Pluto conjunct the south node does. So, Elvis Presley, the Beatles broke through with their British pop rock, I guess I would call it tonight, just to give a comparison, with Elvis Presley. but he really took the early rock and broke through with moving his hips. Talk about the musician who really brought sexuality onto center stage. Elvis Presley. He shot to fame in the years 1956, 57 with his first two albums, and he was on the Ed Sullivan Show, just like the Beatles were. He really, moved forward on the Ed Sullivan Show. And if I can find my notes here, also the Steve Allen Show. And before that, oh God, who was it? Merton Burrell? Was it Milton Berle? These were the early talk show hosts back in black and white TV, just like the Beatles. And during that time period of 1956-57, he went back and forth between these two shows. He literally, Pluto conjunct the South Node, was an overnight success. Eighth house, the shared resources and the mega wealth, and how his estate in Memphis, Tennessee continues to create the wealth and the resources. I'm not a psychic. I don't know what this guy did in a past life to deserve the reputation and to deserve the wealth, but there's going to be something there. If anybody knows it, type it out to Leroy and he'll share it with everybody. There's something about his soul from past lives. Pluto conjunct South Node. Remember, a planet conjunct South Node is either relive, fruition, or a mixture of both. He definitely has the fruition of shared resources. Graceland, that's his home in Memphis, that is still just a huge icon, 25 going on 30, 77. He died in 77 or 78, so 80, 90, 30, 40 years after his death that we're moving into. The relive, I would consider his history with addiction and having Jupiter in Scorpio in the 12th house of addictions. Stay tuned with that in our Pisces archetype for more on addictions in general. But he also has a history with alcohol and drugs, and it's pretty much understood that he died from his overuse of drug substances. And this is where we're looking at some of the distortions with the emotions. Imagine what it was like for him to, be raised again in a very blue collar environment. He was raised in what they call the 2-room shotgun house. And he was an only child. He was close to both parents. And he found his music in church, but again, he was basically just catapulted into fame after growing up in this blue-collar environment, and overnight he had instant wealth, instant fame, and instant adulation from all of the girls and women who just went berserk when he shook his hips on stage. His early concerts people would just go crazy. And this is the middle 1950s, 56, 57, which was when Leroy 56 and Kim Marie 57 were born. Literally, the stages would just be destroyed by people attending his concerts. No, everybody was afraid to bill him because of all the security. They didn't know what that was like back in those days to have to come up with that kind of stuff. It was just crazy how it just exponentiated for him. This is the power of the emotions with this Pluto South Node conjunction, and the sexual connection, eighth house, the emotional connection, Cancer, Leo, again, the fame, you just see it all right here through this. And I sometimes think that Elvis, he didn't quite know how to deal with it all. He would have a close down with it. And then he started the drugs and it became all distorted all over the place with it. In the middle of all this, I don't remember I don't think there was a war, although I'd say it was the Korean War. In the middle of his early career, he actually got drafted into the army and went and served and sang while he was in the force, in the air, or in the military in some way, and then was discharged, and they had to hire all of the security when he came home from the service on the train back to Tennessee, because people were still crazy over him. And he instantly went on to more career and moved into the movies, and they started making movies around his songs. You might know he was married only once. Gosh, what was his wife's name? I don't know if I'm gonna remember her name, but he had the one child, the daughter who was, let me see, was it Lisa Marie?
Lisa Marie from Priscilla Presley.
That's it. Thank you. I was going to say Priscilla. I remember Lisa Marie married Michael Jackson there for a couple of years, and I'm going to venture that the two of them, I don't have her chart or Michael Jackson's in front of me at the moment, but I'm going to say they just bonded over the degree of fame that they both had to deal with, and just wanting to be able to have some element of privacy in their lives. When Elvis went through a lot of the alcohol and addictions and starting gaining weight at the end of his career, he did have some downfalls, but his career downfalls compared to relative Hollywood is a blip on the radar screen. Almost nothing. And I think that he is the most successful artist post-death in the world. I got a tidbit on that with our third example here, but he just continues to be one of the most successful artists. Now, I too can see some of the Pisces element that we're going to talk about here coming up. The moon in Pisces conjunction to Saturn, Jupiter being in that 12th house. You can see that the element of water is in here and more than just Scorpio. You can see it in that Pluto in Cancer generation. I think he was also someone who, for the most part, was pretty private, and being thrust into fame that early was pretty tough. There's a history of him kind of having a little bit of a falling out with the Beatles. He tried to label the Beatles as counterculture and the hippies and the drugs, why he tried to get Nixon at one point, President Nixon, to give him some officers awards and honor his military service. And he was mom and apple pie again, Pluto Cancer, and they had a really tough time selling that to the public again. Because who doesn't remember Elvis coming out with the glitter and glitz, the rhinestones, the flared bell bottoms, and the flamboyant costumes, and moving his body? He was on the Ed Sullivan Show 3 times, and the last time he was on there, they would only show him on TV from the waist up. So he had to take his forefinger, I don't know which hand, and as he was singing, he used his finger to do his sexual innuendos. In other words, the finger moving back and forth in a flowing, hypnotic, um, seductive way, because they would not show his hips. There's the Scorpio sexual energy as we're looking at his example here. Um, he was only married that one time to Priscilla. He did have relationships. He did have some other lovers. I imagine that this guy was bombarded every town he showed up in. Who knows how many sexual lovers he actually had, the way women kind of set loose upon him. Anybody else? Can you see the example from Elvis? The sexual energy, the shared resources of fame and fortune to such a ridiculous level that he, that Capricorn energy in the second, he just couldn't sustain it. And that Jupiter Scorpio 12th, succumbed to the intensity of the addictions. And what can happen with the addictions, skipping ahead a little bit with the Pisces archetype, is we want to sustain the emotional high from the addiction. And we want to, nowadays we don't use any of what we would call our alternative substances in a very shamanistic way, Pisces to no source energy. We use it from the distortions as a substitute for source energy. So comments or questions from anybody? Anything that I did not touch on in regards to that? Anything that I've not said? Little interesting tidbit from my perspective. I was going to look for this and I didn't have the time. I was born in 57, and my father was in the military when I was born. That's why I have a birth place in San Francisco, although I'm from the Northern Plains. And I remember growing up, being born in 57, I remember growing up in the early 60s. I was more of a Monkees fan. The Beatles and Elvis Presley were a little too old for me, but you couldn't miss Elvis Presley as I became an older teenager. And the thing that I had wanted to look up was a picture of my father in the military. I have a father that when he was young and in the military, if you put a picture of him and Elvis Presley side by side, you'd think they were cousins or relatives. I had a father who had those dark, good looks like Elvis and wore his hair the same way. 1950s when he became famous. And so I always have thought of that little tidbit that, oh, isn't it interesting that I have a father who reminds me of Elvis Presley? So that's my earliest memories of this guy. And that, again, I was a little too young, didn't see him as the sex symbol. My mother never mentioned it. I think she was in love with my father at the time, and she had her own Elvis, so she didn't care. But it's a little tidbit for you that I've always, that's my personal recollection to Elvis, although I did also inherit a lot of his, what did they used to call them, 45s, the 33s and 45s, the vinyl records that my mom's older sisters, my aunts used to have. I remember his songs from my early adulthood years. So, anybody else comments or questions with Elvis as an example of the intensity and power of the Scorpio archetype in the water element? The square to Uranus, by the way, in Aries' fifth house, this is this instant fame fifth house early on. And just the T-square with Saturn and Sun, Mercury, Venus, just really not quite knowing how to deal with it. Not really knowing, wanting to rebel from some of that fame and fortune and just find that ability to have privacy. All of the water signs, because water needs a container, all of the water element likes to be able to cocoon and get away from passive polarity, the intensity of the outer world from time to time. Cancer as cardinal modality is going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Scorpio as the fixed modality will sometimes just disappear for a while and be the hermit. And Pisces is the mutable modality, can go either or and all over the place. It ebbs and flows, just probably not as intense or fast as the Cancer cardinal modality. And so finally, we're going to come to the archetype of Pisces, 12th house, and ruler Neptune with the water archetype. As we said, passive polarity. Here we start to work with the mutable modality, which is the energy or mode of action of adaptability, flexibility, fluid. So can you now start to see passive polarity, energy moving inward, mutable modality being very fluid, flowing, flexible, and the element of water, the emotions. Can you just see how Pisces can be boundaryless? Can you see how Pisces can just be permeating everywhere with everything? This is the last of the 12 archetypes, and so in evolutionary astrology, we'll know this archetype is universal source on the deepest level. It is the totality of consciousness. It's the collective conscious unconsciousness of all species, because basically this archetype contains all 12 archetypes. It contains all 11 archetypes, Aries to Aquarius, that came before it. This is water holding the largest container possible, moving beyond the physical earth containers, Virgo polarity. And so again, whereas Cancer was the early familial environment, Scorpio was the intimacy environment, Pisces becomes the spiritual environment, or the environment of source energy and all that is. And this is why the Pisces archetype is so related to returning to source energy. And so Pisces, being all that is, collective conscious unconsciousness, can be boundaryless. Water has no container again. And one of the most basic distortions of Pisces is unhealthy boundaries, boundaryless, having no boundaries, no ability to discern between self and another. And this is one of the basic lessons of the archetype of Pisces and the water element is learning healthy boundaries. What is me and what is the other one? We take that psychological intuitiveness of Scorpio between itself and another, and we bring it on to the last of the water elements, Pisces, passive polarity, mutable modality. And this is where we have the shaman, the healer, the person who is psychic on some of the deepest levels, being able to pick up on anything and everything with anyone and everyone. So if we've not been building a healthy emotional container through Cancer, Scorpio, we're not going to have a healthy emotional container with Pisces. And if we don't have that healthy container and we don't know what's us and what's them, we can easily become the victim. We can easily have others run over us. Passive polarity, mutable modality. So if we don't have that healthy emotional container with and therefore no healthy boundaries, we don't know how to have the Virgo polarity discernment. Yes, no, right, wrong, good, bad, healthy, unhealthy. So can you see how this archetype can then become related to what we would call addictions from substances? Now, in this case, we're not just talking about drugs and alcohol. Via the Virgo polarity, earth element, diet, exercise, and rest, we can become addicted to any substance. We can become addicted to sugar. We can become addicted to unhealthy physical routines. We can become an exerciseaholic. We can become addicted on physical, emotional, mental, spiritual levels. And when we're working with this on some of the deepest levels with the archetype of Pisces, we then have to know that Virgo polarity of yes, no, how to partake or not partake on any level of any substance, down to the basics of food. This is why your Pisces archetype can be so sensitive to anything that is put into the container of the body. I have some of my cliches is that karma is healed when the charge is neutral. So addictions are healed when their charge is neutral. When you can say yes or no. When you can partake and the next time you don't partake. And the next time you partake and the next time you don't partake and the next time you don't partake until you let it go. That's the shedding, that's the releasing on the deepest levels of Pisces. Passive polarity, let it go. Energy moving back to the center. Mutable modality, let it go. And so everything about the archetype of Pisces is about releasing any and all separating desires on an emotional level from the archetype of Scorpio. And then taking the returning archetype or returning emotions of Scorpio and really wanting to have an environment that is sourceful. And then being able to ebb and flow into the physical and back to non-physical, however it is highest and best for any of us. The cliche, I will, my will, divine will. The distortions is not being able to balance that, not having healthy enough water containers that we have a sense of self, Cancer, we have a sense of others, Scorpio, and we have a sense of self, source energy, guiding us, being the ultimate resource that feeds the water, that senses the water, senses to the emotions. Any questions or comments? Anything with just trying to understand the element of water to the archetype of Pisces that I didn't cover? All right, our last example. Kurt Cobain, another musician. Birth data is February 20th, 1967. Born at 7:20 p.m. in Aberdeen, Washington State. The rising sign is 19 Virgo 59. And of course, he's a middle 60s baby, so he has a Pluto-Uranus conjunction, late 60s, new phase, Uranus to Pluto. But where that ascended is 1959 Virgo. He's a 12th house Pluto, a Pisces soul, 1947 Virgo. Pluto is 12 minutes from the ascendant, not 12 degrees, 12 minutes, literally less than a quarter of a degree. He has 5 planets in Pisces. He has Sun at 2 degrees Pisces, Mercury 18 in the 6th house. He has Pisces descendant, 7th house cusp, and he has Chiron, Venus, and Saturn between 24 and 29 degrees Pisces. So Saturn is approaching 29 degrees Pisces. It's 28, just shy of 29 degrees. Saturn is entering the last degree of the zodiac with Pisces. So isn't it interesting? The soul Pluto, 12th house Pluto, tail end of the 12th house, and its structure of consciousness, Saturn in Pisces, second to last degree of the zodiac. When I was searching through charts and I saw this one, I immediately went, ooh, Pisces archetype, here it is. Now he happens to have 2 planets in Cancer, Moon in Cancer 10th, Jupiter Cancer 11th, and he has 2 planets, Mars Scorpio 2nd, Neptune Scorpio 3rd, and a south node in Scorpio. Could the guy have more water in his chart? He's got a grand trine in water between Neptune, Jupiter, and basically Venus, Chiron, drags Saturn in if you want as well. So this guy is nothing but walking emotions. Now he, again, was born in Washington. I don't know if Aberdeen's a suburb of Washington or not. I don't know that detail. But he came to popularity in the grunge scene with the band Nirvana in the Seattle area. And he belongs to that 27 generation, meaning Janis Joplin, James Dean. You guys can probably think of some more famous artists out there who all seem to have checked out at the age 27. Actors, musicians, that whole entertainment industry. There's going to be something about the harmonics of the number 27 that'll relate to astrology and the approaching Saturn return. There's something about that age 27 we're going to come to discover in astrology, because there's so many famous people in that entertainment world who checked out at age 27. And it's usually a dramatic death. It's usually an addiction, an overdose, an accident, just something that's been dramatic about them not making it to the Saturn return. So I'm sure you could look at his Pisces planets in the descendant, and Saturn was probably somewhere along there in his seventh house cusp at age 27 as he was approaching that Saturn return, and it was, who knows where it was. I didn't have time to look up the actual chart on the date of his death. That's something you could follow through on if you want to discover that detail with him. He was, again, another blue-collar kid. His mom was a waitress. His dad was an automotive mechanic. He is an Irish background. He has one younger sister, Kimberly. His family has a musical background. Now, here's what was interesting about him, and I've seen this with 12th house Plutos. 12th house Plutos, I don't know if I want to be here on planet Earth. They many times will come in, of course, very sensitive, psychic children, but many times they'll come in happy. They'll come in just kind of floating through life. And sooner or later, something will happen and it almost shuts them down. Sixth house polarity, Virgo polarity. And so Kurt Cobain was a very happy child. His bedroom was an art studio. He had grandmothers, aunts that were very supportive of him in his early environment and very supportive of him being in the art world of some time, at some point. Well, get this. Saturn square, 7 years old. So I'm going to imagine that Saturn was up here in the 10th house in Gemini. His parents divorced at 7, and it really affected him. He went from being a happy, carefree child to shutting down. So look at right here. And it's known in a lot of psychological astrology that if you don't bond with the nurturing parent or parents between 0 and 7, when you reach that first Saturn square and you become aware of mortality and the world out there and the authoritarian parent or father figure, this would have been where the transiting Saturn was, Gemini square this Pisces energy. If you don't have that bonding with the nurturing environment between 0 and 7, you can approach that first Saturn square and it can have a major effect on whether you trust the world or not. And here would have been transiting Saturn when his parents divorced up here in Gemini, but 10th house opposite the 4th house, the nurturing environment and the whole parental polarity that went on for him and how that had such effect on him. He has stated publicly that he didn't know how to relate to his environment because everybody else had a mom and dad, and his parents got divorced. His mom went on and got another relationship, but she dated a gentleman who was abusive, Pisces, 12th house, lack of healthy boundaries. We go into the extremes of abuse. It's not just substances. It can be with others. And so his mom was a victim of domestic violence to the point where she ended up in the hospital with a broken arm. Kurt Cobain, turned into a bully. He tried to have a relationship with his father. It didn't work again. Tried Christianity with his father. Tried Buddhism. That's where the band Nirvana was formed. And he always said that Buddhism, because it wanted to detach itself from the material world, Pisces energy, Virgo polarity, that's why he related to Buddhism. He ended up as a bully, recognizing he couldn't really do it very well. And he started becoming very aware of others who were bullied. So he found himself making friends with gay people. He was accused of being gay. He publicly said he never was. It's just that when he associated with the gay community, people didn't bully him or bug him. He was able to have boundaries, a sense of privacy. And again, you look at this 12th house Pluto here, and then all these Pisces planets. This is someone who could feel so exposed. All that water, wanting a container, and then Uranus. Here's a planet that's not in a water sign or house, and it's right inside the ascendant a few degrees. It's also retrograde. So how do I rebel? How do I break free from this deep container I find myself in? Many of you might know he ended up in relationship with Courtney Love. He ended up in, again, I don't know how you details of grunge other than to me it's real hard rock. And so he ended up in that world, and of course it led to sex, drugs, and alcohol. He was smoking marijuana early on. It led to more and more drugs. I think he basically died of he died of suicide with a shotgun blast to the head. But he, Uranus, first house, he was well known for abusing drugs and abusing heroin along with his wife Courtney, and there was a lot of controversy around the fact that she supposedly was using heroin with him before she knew she was pregnant with Kurt Cobain's only child, a daughter. And so when this baby was born, um, they actually had, I don't know if it was social services, the court systems, I don't know who, but the little baby girl was taken away from mom and dad when it was born because of all the suspicions and public issues around the drug abuse. So can you see the sensitivity going on here on the Cancer level with Moon in Cancer and him as a father, and just triggering South Node Scorpio with Mars there, the abandonment issues, not only from the parental divorce, but having the child taken away from him, and all of that energy and issues. The child was born in 92, and I want to say that he committed suicide in spring of 1994. So his daughter was just a very young child at that point. This is the guy who is second place behind Elvis as being very, very successful post-death. And as a matter of fact, again, this guy died in 1994. In 2006, he drew ahead of Elvis Presley in the sales of his estate artistry. And then 1 year later, Presley took over as first place again. And so I thought, isn't that interesting? Again, we have another Mars conjunct Scorpio, or excuse me, another Mars in Scorpio conjunct the South Node in Scorpio. Remember, Elvis was Pluto conjunct South Node in 8th house. So look at this, just being so famous after you're there. Scorpio, death and rebirth, sometimes literal. And planets conjunct the South Node, relive, fruition. So obviously this person has had something, probably many past lives, trying to deal with the emotions. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a chart with so much water. I thought I had water in my chart. No, this guy probably has more water than I've ever seen in a chart. He was very alternative, again, because of all of his sensitivities. He was very, very supportive of indie bands, grunge bands, underground music. He was very, very supportive of gay rights way before it became popular. Supportive of almost everything alternative. But for whatever reasons, This is someone who couldn't quite get his life together and be able to hold healthy boundaries and healthy containers on the ultimate level, Pisces, on familial levels, Cancer, on intimacy levels, Scorpio, on all of the substance abuse issues, Pisces. So, anything that I've not discussed on this chart that you would like me to give some comments on or address with you? He was admitted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the earliest year that he was eligible. So I don't know if it means so many years after your death or so many years after certain record sales or whatever. I mean, 75 million records, and this guy didn't put out a lot of albums. So very, very, very strong, almost, what would you call, devotionistic Pisces following by his age group. All right, here. So just winding down a little bit. Again, anything with this archetype of Pisces that I've not addressed, or this chart that you'd like me to comment on. Anything on the water element in general, or anything as we finish up this series. I hope it's been somewhat helpful for you. Again, my focus was to just really concentrate on either the modality or the element as we've went through this series, and to utilize charts that we all know focusing on the modality or element in that chart. All right, as I'm waiting to see if there's anything coming across from the board. Here is one final slide on the water trine, Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, or 4th, 8th, 12th houses, and that element of water and its emotions. And finally, here are the classes that I have set up. As you can see, going to be a little busy in January. Thank goodness it's cold in the northern plains. Here is next Monday with one more time. Pluto square the nodes, Uranus conjunct the south node as they are active in mid-January. I'm going to work with some forecasting on that. 2015 forecast in January. A little bit longer over Saturn and Sag over the next 2.5, 3 years. And so here are some of our upcoming classes. And finally, if anybody is interested, I will also be teaching a weekend workshop, February 6th, 7th, 8th, down in the Tampa Bay, Florida area. You can attend this workshop live. It'll take place in a private home right on the ocean. You can also register and receive the recordings and materials after the live event. I thank you all for moving with me through this 7-part series on modalities and elements through October, November, December of 2014.